June 15, 1944, Saipan, in the Mariana Islands. Deep in the jungle, hidden inside a bunker carved into a hillside, a Japanese officer named Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Yamamoto sat alone with his headphones pressed tight against his ears. Outside, the war was everywhere. Artillery boomed in the distance. Palm trees rustled in the humid Pacific wind. Waves crashed against black volcanic rocks. But inside that bunker, Yamamoto was focused on something else. Something that was driving him absolutely crazy. Through the static and crackling of his radio, he could hear voices. American voices. They were speaking clearly, without any scrambling or coding devices. Just plain human voices. But the words made absolutely no sense. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language he'd ever heard before. And Yamamoto wasn't some amateur. He'd studied at Berkeley. He spoke perfect English. He'd broken American codes before. He'd been decorated for his intelligence work in China. Behind him, 3 of Japan's best code breakers sat hunched over their notebooks, exhausted and frustrated. For 18 months, they'd been recording these strange transmissions. 18 months of analysis, of pattern hunting, of trying everything they could think of. And for 18 months, they'd failed completely. The Americans were transmitting battlefield coordinates, troop movements, artillery targets, critical information that could change the outcome of entire battles. And they were doing it out in the open, with no encryption machines, no code books, nothing, just voices on the radio. And Japan, with all its brilliant cryptographers and all its military intelligence, couldn't understand a single word. This wasn't supposed to happen. Earlier in the Pacific War, Japanese intelligence had been incredibly successful. They'd intercepted American Navy messages. They'd anticipated fleet movements. They'd exploited careless radio mistakes. Japan's code breakers were the best. Many of them educated at Western universities, fluent in English, trained in advanced mathematics and linguistics. They'd cracked British codes. They'd decoded Chinese messages. They'd even penetrated Soviet intelligence networks. These weren't amateurs playing at spy games. These were professionals at the top of their field. But this mysterious language crackling through their headphones was something entirely different. Something they'd never encountered before. Japanese intelligence expected American communications to be sophisticated, sure, but ultimately breakable. They understood encryption technology. They knew the patterns of military codes. They'd intercepted thousands of Allied messages and built their entire intelligence operation on one basic assumption. Given enough time and enough analysis, any code could be broken. What they didn't expect, what they couldn't possibly have imagined, was that America would deploy a weapon that made traditional code breaking completely irrelevant. A code that wasn't built on mathematics or clever letter substitutions, but on something far more powerful, on culture, on identity, on the voices of men whose ancestors had lived on the American continent for thousands of years before any European explorer ever set foot on its shores. This was the Navajo Code. The idea started in 1942 with a man named Philip Johnston, a white civil engineer who'd grown up on a Navajo reservation in the American Southwest. Johnston understood something that military planners had completely overlooked. The Navajo language was extraordinarily complex. It was tonal, meaning the pitch of your voice changed the meaning of words. It had never been written down. And here's the key part. Fewer than 30 non-Navajo people in the entire world could speak it fluently. And not a single one of them was Japanese. The language had no alphabet, no relatives in any other language family, no presence in any university or military curriculum anywhere in the world. It was, in essence, an unbreakable code created not by human engineering but by history itself. The first 29 Navajo recruits arrived at Camp Pendleton in May 1942. They were young men from the mesas and deserts of Arizona and New Mexico. Many of them had been sent to government boarding schools as children, where they'd been punished, sometimes brutally, for speaking their native language. Teachers had beaten them for using Navajo words. The government had tried to erase their culture, to make them forget who they were. And now, That same government was asking them to weaponize the very language it had tried to destroy. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. But these young men answered the call anyway. And they did something brilliant. They developed a code within the code. The Navajo language didn't have words for modern military equipment. There was no Navajo word for tank or submarine or bomber. So the code talkers invented them. A tank became che dagahi, which meant tortoise. A submarine became beshlo, ironfish. A dive bomber became genie, chicken hawk. For the alphabet, they used animal names. The letter A was wallachi, ant. B was shush, bear. And to make it even harder to crack, each letter had multiple Navajo words assigned to it, preventing any kind of pattern recognition. It was elegant, it was instant, and it was utterly impossible to break. On Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Paleliu, Iwo Jima, wherever the Marines advanced across the Pacific, Navajo voices went with them. They transmitted coordinates for artillery strikes. They called in air support. They relayed troop movements. All of it in real time, with no encryption delay. A message that would normally take a cipher machine 30 minutes to encode and decode could be spoken and understood by a code talker in just seconds. Perfect speed married to perfect security. Meanwhile, Japanese listening posts were going crazy. They recorded everything. They played the transmissions backward, thinking maybe it was reversed English. They analyzed syllable frequencies, hunting desperately for any kind of pattern. They compared recordings from different islands, different battles, looking for consistency that might reveal some underlying structure. Their linguists consulted with experts in obscure Asian and Pacific languages, wondering if maybe this was some unknown dialect from the Philippines or the Solomon Islands. Nothing worked. Nothing even came close. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto, the man who'd broken codes before, who'd studied at one of America's best universities, who spoke flawless English, who'd been decorated for his brilliance, sat in that bunker on Saipan and confronted something worse than a difficult puzzle. He confronted his own irrelevance. No amount of skill, no mathematical genius, no dedication or hard work could penetrate this barrier. The code wasn't complex in the traditional sense. It was foreign in a way that went beyond analysis, beyond logic, beyond everything his training had prepared him for. After the war ended, during Allied interrogations of Japanese officers, they spoke about the code talkers with a mixture of deep frustration and genuine respect. Major General Seizo Arisui, Chief of Intelligence for the Imperial Japanese Army, put it plainly. "We never cracked it. We couldn't even identify what language it was." Another officer admitted that at first, they'd believed it must be some kind of sophisticated machine-based encryption system. It seemed so systematic, so secure, that it couldn't possibly be just human voices speaking freely. When they finally realized the truth, it was almost harder to accept. One captured Japanese cryptographer, when he was presented with actual recordings of Navajo transmissions after the war, listened very carefully. Then he gave his assessment, and it was chilling in its simplicity. Whoever designed this understood that language itself could be a weapon. You didn't just encrypt your words, you encrypted your very identity. And that identity, Native American, indigenous, rooted in the very land that Japan had sought to threaten, became a powerful symbol of something the Japanese military had never anticipated. The Americans weren't just technologically advanced or industrially superior. They were diverse. They could reach into cultures, languages, and perspectives that spanned continents and thousands of years of history. The Navajo Code Talkers represented a kind of strength that couldn't be manufactured in any laboratory or taught in any military academy. It was born from history itself, from survival, from the incredible resilience of a people who had endured genocide, forced relocation, cultural erasure, and had emerged from all of it still speaking their language, still holding on to their identity. Japan had built its entire military philosophy on homogeneity, on the belief that unity of culture and purpose would create an invincible fighting force. But America, chaotic, immigrant-built, beautifully multicultural America had turned its greatest supposed weakness into its most devastating weapon. By the war's end, more than 400 Navajo Code Talkers had served in the Pacific Theater. They participated in every single major Marine Corps operation from 1942 to 1945. And here's the most remarkable statistic of all. Not a single Navajo code was ever broken. Not one, not even partially. The impact this had on Japanese military thinking was profound. After battles like Saipan and Iwo Jima, captured Japanese officers spoke not just about American firepower or industrial capacity, but about something harder to define: adaptability. The Americans, they said, fought without rigid doctrine. They improvised. They incorporated the unexpected. They turned what should have been a weakness, their lack of cultural homogeneity, into an incredible strength. For Japanese cryptographers like Yamamoto, the Code Talkers represented something more devastating than a battlefield defeat. It was an intellectual defeat. The crushing realization that the enemy possessed advantages that simply couldn't be studied, couldn't be replicated, couldn't be overcome through effort or brilliance. Some weapons, they learned, aren't forged in factories. They're inherited through centuries of survival. When the war finally ended in 1945, the Navajo Code Talkers came home. Many returned to reservations where they still lacked basic voting rights, where poverty and discrimination were simply facts of daily life. And they couldn't even talk about what they'd done. The code itself remained classified for decades. They couldn't tell their families, couldn't share their stories, couldn't explain why they'd been away or what they'd accomplished. The secret was too valuable to reveal. It wasn't until 1968, more than 20 years after the war ended, that the Navajo Code Talker program was finally declassified. And it took until 2001, 56 years after the war, for the original 29 Code Talkers to receive congressional gold medals, America's highest civilian honor. But in the steaming jungles of the Pacific, in the static-filled listening posts of Japanese intelligence, their voices had already won the war. Lieutenant Commander Yamamoto survived the conflict. In interviews many years later, he spoke with quiet, almost reluctant admiration about the adversary he'd never seen, never met, but had struggled against for years. "We believed we could break any code," he said simply. "We'd done it before. We had the best people, the best training, the best equipment. But the Americans didn't give us a code to break. They gave us a language that belonged to a people we didn't even know existed. How do you fight that? You can't. You simply can't." The Navajo Code Talkers weren't the fastest runners or the strongest soldiers. They didn't pilot fighter planes or command battleships. But they carried within them something far more powerful than any conventional weapon. They were living proof that democracy isn't a weakness, that a nation built by immigrants and indigenous peoples and the descendants of slaves could reach deep into its own beautiful complexity and find absolute genius. The Japanese had expected American communications to be mechanical, predictable, ultimately breakable with enough effort. What they found instead was something that transcended their entire understanding of warfare. They found the sound of history itself, ancient and utterly modern at the same moment, encoded not in mathematics or mechanical ciphers, but in survival, in resistance, in the absolute refusal to be erased from existence. And in the end, that sound, those Navajo voices speaking clearly across the crackling static of wartime radios, said something that no encryption machine, no matter how sophisticated, could ever communicate. They said, "We are still here, we are still speaking, and you will never, ever understand us." That was the real code. Not unbreakable because it was mathematically complex or cleverly designed, but unbreakable because it was truth itself. The truth of a people who had survived everything history threw at them and emerged stronger. Their language intact, their identity unshaken. And that truth won the war.